Hi. I know for many of us in the upper Midwest, here in the Chicago area especially, it's winter with a vengeance here on 7th day of January 2022. But it's not too early to start thinking about birding in the springtime. You know, uh, birding became very popular the last couple of years during the pandemic. It's a great way to get outdoors. And I'm going to be talking about in a presentation that I've given several times, how to get started in birding. Spring's a great time, and I think you're going to enjoy learning a little bit about spring birding. So let's start birding. Why bird watching? There's a lot of hobbies you can have, but bird watching is a great one. Well, birds can be watched almost anywhere. I've watched birds sitting in a parking lot waiting for somebody to come out of a store. I've watched birds sitting on my deck in Glen Ellen. I've watched birds taking just a walk around the block. So birds are almost anywhere. Birds are active when we're active. Yes, certain times of the year you do need to get up with the birds, but basically, like people, most birds are diurnal. They're daytime creatures. Birds are easy to observe. They may fly around, they may be active sometime, but they're large and you can easily see them. It helps if you have binoculars, but you don't need them if you're just starting out. I think bird watching is a great way to learn to appreciate nature and learn about the environment. I've been interested in birds my entire life, going on 7 decades. I have always learned something new by watching birds. And what's important is my concern for birds, my passion for birds has led me to investigate other aspects of nature and other issues related to the world we live in and ecosystems. And finally, it's a great family activity. You can get your kids off the screen outdoors. You can come up with all kinds of games. It helps kids to learn that they're part of a natural world too. You know, I've read places that most children know more about tigers and whales and fur seals than they know about the animals that live in their own backyard. So this is a great way to get kids interested in nature. Now, where to go? Well, I'm in northeastern Illinois. I'm in DuPage County. And DuPage County has a really fine forest preserve system. And almost every forest preserve I've visited has been an excellent place to go birding, and they're all good places to go birding. Will County has great forest preserves. Kane County has forest preserves. Here in DuPage County, the Illinois Prairie Path's a good place to walk and see birds. Great Western Trail, the Morton Arboretum, Cantigny. These are all good places. And your own yard is a fine place to watch birds. I've seen over 100 species in my yard, flying over my yard. And I don't live in an especially wild area. In fact, I live in a very typical neighborhood in Glen Ellen. So plenty of places to go. Don't be afraid to go exploring. Question comes up, when should you go? Well, if you want to see or try to see the most birds with the least amount of effort, I guess I'd say, spring and fall migrations are good times to go. During spring, the birds are in their bright breeding plumage. During the fall, there's a lot more birds because the young are going down, migrating with the adult birds. Yes, early in the day is a good time to go. In fact, if you're in the height of the breeding season, say June, July, August, you might want to get up around sunrise and go out and come back in at 8 o'clock in the morning, because during those early morning hours, the birds are most active. They tend to get a little bit more active in the hour or so before sunset too. But anytime's a good time. If it's winter, especially early winter, visit larger bodies of water. We have some large lakes in DuPage and Cook counties. Of course, there's Lake Michigan. And what you'll see are what are called diving ducks. These are ducks that come from the far north, and they actually winter in our area. Now, I'm a member of the DuPage Birding Club. So if you go to DuPageorg.org, DuPageBirding.org, you can see a list of hotspots with descriptive brochures. I've written a few myself, and these are places that I find easy to bird, productive to bird, and but that's not to say that now is as good time as any. Birding doesn't require much in the way of equipment or needs. A good field guide is a big help. I like Roger Tory Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds, especially for beginners. Sibley's guide is widely used today. It's a little more detailed than Peterson's. I personally have some reservation about apps you put on your phone. I think they're very good if you have an idea of what you're looking at and you want to determine it for sure. But if you're just starting out, take a book, field guide or two out of the library, look at the pictures, try to familiarize yourself with some of the birds you're going to be seeing. I know that there's probably about 20 or so birds that you'll really get to know, and you need to become familiar. Binoculars are a big help. I own several pairs. Now, don't be fooled thinking that high magnification is a good thing. High magnification has its purposes. I like using high magnification when I'm looking over water, say I'm at a large lake, or when I spend time in Florida looking over the Gulf and looking where I'm looking at birds at some distance. But if you're getting a first pair of binoculars, a pair 735 or 842 are best. The first number gives its magnification. The second number gives the size in millimeters of the objective lens, that is the lens closest to the bird. And that determines how bright the image is going to be. So with that, what I have here, the 735s are just slightly dimmer than the 842s, but they're both good ones to use. I have some very expensive pairs. I have some very moderately priced pairs. In fact, to be honest with you, as I've gotten more and more into photography, I use an 825. It has a real narrow field of view. I have to be careful where I point them. It helps if the bird's in good light, but they're very lightweight. Not that the other two sizes are overly heavy, but I find when I'm carrying a camera around my neck, I don't want a heavy pair of binoculars. Finally, you'll want a notebook for recording what you see. Even if you have questions, describe the bird as you see it, describe its behavior, take note of when and where you see it. And if you're doing backyard birding, your own eyes and ears are enough. And even if you go out and walk along a trail, you'll be surprised at how much you can see and hear without the equipment I've mentioned here. But I definitely start out by getting a book. Now you might say, well, what am I going to see? Well, look at these numbers. I've checked a couple online sources. So far, over 1,000 species of birds have been recorded in the United States. Illinois has somewhere in the neighborhood of 430, 440 species of birds. New ones seem to show up almost every year. DuPage County, where I live, it's mostly suburban, although we do have excellent forest preserves and other open spaces. 317 species have been recorded in DuPage County. My own backyard, like I said, it's typical Glen Ellen neighborhood. In fact, I have some questions about the kinds of trees the village has planted in the boulevard. They're not bird-friendly trees, but I've seen over 100 species. One day I must have been very bored because I looked over my bird walk records. I took any bird walk in DuPage County that lasted an hour or more. And I found on a typical bird walk, I would see anywhere from 20 to 25 species. So more than 25 species is a pretty good bird walk. Now, I think when you're getting started, You need to learn to recognize some of the common species. And like I say here, before you decide what it is, decide what it isn't. The American robin, it's a must-learn species. I would have thought just about everybody knows an American robin, but I've worked with school children here in Glen Ellen and in Wheaton who could not identify an American robin. I've worked with adults who confused the American robin with another bird, the Baltimore oriole. So get to know the American robin. And once you could do that, you could look at this bird that I have, this other photograph. It's about the same size as an American robin, but how is it different? Well, for one thing, its legs seem a little bit longer. It has a very distinct red eye. It's brown on top, it's white underneath. It has a white collar, so to speak. And this is the killdeer, a very common bird in many parts of the county. In fact, they're kind of known for nesting on top of buildings. I know that's where they nest at College of DuPage quite often. Here's another must-learn bird, the mallard. It's probably our most common duck. Well, not all water birds are duck. If you saw the bird below, how would you describe its difference? Well, you might note that it's slightly larger than a mallard duck. That was kind of hard to see at the distance at which I took this photograph originally, but you can see it has a black head. It's kind of a black and white checkered back. It has a bill shaped differently. It's a dark bill. In fact, this is a common loon. Now, if you're up in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, you've heard loons laughing, I'm sure. But loons migrate through Illinois and are not uncommon on some of the larger lakes in DuPage County. I believe I took this one at West Branch Forest Preserve. And if I didn't take it there, I probably took it at Mallard Lake. Now we have 20 or so local species that I think it helps if you learn them. And I have a list here. I won't go through the list, but the bird on top is probably our most common or second most common woodpecker. It's called a red-bellied woodpecker. I know you see the red head, you want to call it a red-headed woodpecker, but that's a distinct species. A male red-headed woodpecker has an entirely red head, black back, and white underneath. The red-bellied woodpecker, the males get kind of a pink reddish blush on their breast feathers in the mating season. The red-winged blackbird, this is a male during breeding season, another very, very common bird. I remember teaching a class at COD. I was an English teacher in a biology class, long story there. But we had students who claimed they never seen a red-winged blackbird. We took them out of the building, looked up at the nearest telephone wire, and there were about 20 male red-winged blackbirds perched on the wire. So this is a good list of birds to get to know. And then there's the infamous little brown bird, the little brown bird. Let me tell you, we're often asked by non-birders to identify them. Well, here's two little brown birds. They're very distinct species, but how would you describe them? What differences do you see? Well, you might notice, for example, the one on top has a yellow eyebrow. You might notice slight differences in the color of the bird and the streaking of the bird. In fact, the one on top is called a savanna sparrow, and it's a very common bird in the open grasslands of our forest preserves. The one on the bottom is a song sparrow, a very common bird in many habitats throughout DuPage County, brush habitats along the edges of marshes and so on. It's called a song sparrow because it has a rather sweet warbling song. So let's talk about some birds you're going to see locally. Well, there's Canada goose. You know, I remember very distinctly the first Canada geese I saw in DuPage County. It was April 1976. I was at I believe it was East Branch Forest Preserve in the morning. I was teaching at the time, and it was spring break. It was a very foggy morning, and out of the fog, a small flock of Canada geese flew by. Before then, I had to go all the way up to Horicon, Wisconsin, if I wanted to be assured of seeing Canada geese. But beginning in the 1970s, Canada geese began exploiting really prime habitats we've created in suburbia. And if you play golf, you know what I mean. Now, watch the flocks of Canada geese very closely. Sometimes you'll see a bird that looks like a Canada goose, but isn't much bigger than a mallard duck. Well, those are called cackling geese. And besides being smaller, their bill has a slightly different shape, but they too occur in DuPage County. I've already talked about the mallard duck. This is the male in breeding plumage. During the late summer, early fall, most ducks, especially mallard ducks, go in what's called eclipse plumage, where they lose their mating plumage and they look very, very similar to the female duck. Now we have some immigrants you're going to see sooner or later. And again, these are good birds to get to know. One is rock pigeon. You might call it pigeon. And this is the one you can see along, train lines, along train tracks. They're very common in Glen Ellen. Never had one in my backyard. They stick to very urban areas. The bird next to it is a house sparrow. These were introduced in the United States in the 1850s to help control an insect that showed up from England called the linen moth. Very adaptable birds. A lot of people consider them a pest. A lot of birders really don't like them all that much. But I consider them a bird that has been able to use habitats we've created in our urban and suburban areas that other birds simply haven't been able to adapt to. Certainly, if you put out a bird feeder, you're going to get house sparrows and they will attract other birds. Now, here's another alien, the European starling. These were introduced a little bit later. They were introduced in the 1890s. If you study American culture, we've had a kind of an internal war between writing the great American novel and playing lip service to European culture. Certainly, if you listen to our classical music, it's highly Eurocentric. Our artists go over to Paris and study art in Paris by and large. And one of the signs of this Eurocentrism were groups in the 19th century that were bringing in birds from Europe. One individual or one group was especially interested in introducing all the birds mentioned by Shakespeare in his plays and poems. And there were quite a few, as a matter of fact. The only one that took was the European starling. And again, this is another bird you'll see perched on telephone wires. If you go into the country and you go around farms, they stay around farm buildings. They do compete with a lot of our other birds. What's interesting, starlings have done very, very well in North America. At the same time, they're declining in Europe and their natural area. Well, if you look up at the sky, you're going to see birds of prey. And these are the two I see most often in DuPage County. From about late March, April, right through October and even early November, you'll see turkey vultures up in the air. They come up here to breed. They're scavengers, eat dead animals, very important to the healthy ecosystem. And our resident bird of prey is a red-tailed hawk. This is a young female that was been brought into Willowbrook Wildlife Haven. And I happened to be in the forest preserve where it was released. If you look at the left leg, you can see a bird band on it. These are large soaring birds. You can see them over even downtown areas sometimes. I have had them perched to my tree. I've had them fly through my neighborhoods. They feed on primarily small mammals, squirrels, mice, rabbits once in a while. And they're with us year round. Now, there's lots of other kinds of hawks that come through DuPage County, but that's why you're going to get a book and look at it and decide for yourself what you're seeing. But red-tailed hawk and turkey vultures are good birds of prey to get to know. Both of them are soaring birds. You'll see them riding air currents rather than flapping their wings. There's a lot of birds you'll see over lakes and rivers. These two are the most common. The ring-billed gull is probably our most common gull. It's a parking lot bird. Most gulls are scavengers. In fact, most seagulls really aren't found all that far out in the sea. But this is the one you'll see most commonly down here. And you can see it's called a ring-billed gull because it has a ring, the adult at least has the ring on a bill. It has yellow legs. If you see a similar bird, slightly larger, but with pink legs, lacking that ring and having a little pink spot on its bill, that's the herring gull. They used to be more common than ring-billed gulls, but for a number of years now, ring-billed gulls are really succeeding as we alter the environment. A really beautiful bird to see is the Caspian tern. It's most commonly seen during spring and fall migrations, although I've seen them late during the summer. Some debate whether or not they nest here. They're they're about the size of a ring-billed gull or crow size. So they're larger than a pigeon. You can see they're a very white bird with that real distinct black cap and a kind of a blood red beak. They're a beautiful bird to see in good light. Along the banks of our rivers and ponds, you're liable to see two wading birds, the great blue heron, which is our largest heron, and the great egret. Great blue heron, you can see, is a little darker. The great egret is adult, is all white. What I find interesting is I spend a number of months every year in Florida, and there are a lot of smaller wading birds, related birds to these herons and egrets in Florida. These two are actually rather uncommon where I am. On wires and trees, well, you have a relative of the rock pigeon, and that's the mourning dove. Again, a robin-sized bird. During the colder months of the year, they congregate in very large flocks. During the cold weather too, if you have maybe a bare patch in your yard of soil that warms up with the sun at some point during the day, it's not unusual to have mourning doves congregate there and just bask. And of course, a real favorite bird for a lot of people is the ruby-throated hummingbird. They come usually sometime in May. I put my hummingbird feeders out the first or second week of May, depending on the weather. And usually by the end of May, I'll have them, and they'll stick around through October. They're DuPage County's smallest bird. The great blue heron was the largest bird. Ruby-throated hummingbird's the smallest bird. Well, we've already talked about birds you see on the red trees, the red-bellied woodpecker, here's another photograph of one. Another very common woodpecker is the downy woodpecker. It's not much larger than a sparrow, the house sparrow. You can see that the little red cap that the male has, the female lacks that cap. If you go around barns and fields, we have two species of swallow that are common in our area. One is the tree swallow, and it's a beautiful little blue bird, white-bellied, very slender and sleek. You'll find them in around water often. They skim over the surface of the water, catching insects. They're hole nesters, and if you put out a birdhouse in the right habitat, you may get a tree swallow pair moving in. And the other common swallow in our area is the barn swallow. And you can see this one is very dark, blue-black actually, and it has that rusty face and throat. If you go into the woods, there are two birds that you'll probably see and hear. And if you put out a bird feeder, especially if it's with sunflower seed or suet, you're going to see the white-breasted nuthatch and the black-capped chickadee. Nuthatch is slightly smaller than a sparrow. You'll see this one quite often spiraling down a tree trunk head first. It's hard to believe that. They have a call too that you might hear taking a walk. It's often been described as yank, yank, yank. The black-capped chickadee, I think, to a lot of people, is an underappreciated bird. It gets its name. You can see the black cap, the black throat, white cheeks, gray back. But it has a call that it uses to stay in touch with other chickadees, and it's chickadee, chickadee, dee, 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 dee. And also in the woods, especially if it's an oak woods, you're liable to see and hear blue jays. They're relatives, believe it or not, of the crow. They're very smart birds, and I always enjoy seeing them. I always have trouble photographing them though, because they like to stay in the shade, and the blue doesn't come out so well. And that's because blue in birds' feathers isn't the result of pigment, it's the result of little crystals that act like prisms that break up the light. So I've seen blue jays in the shade with their crests down, and it's a fairly nondescript bird. And at the edges of woods, you're going to see two. The eastern bluebird, slightly larger than a sparrow, not much. The male is blue on top, has a nice rust red breast, chest. Female's paler. And of course, the American robin. You know, robins weren't all that common in DuPage County up until about the 1930s. I know that because there's a famous amateur naturalist named Benjamin Galt who lived in Glen Ellen and kept very detailed records of birds. And he describes the robin as a summer visitor, when in fact, right now, robins occur in the county year round. You need to go to a wooded area. I see where there's maybe open water and a lot of berries. I've seen them in January and February during very cold weather at Herrick Lake. Well, we talk about blackbirds. Oddly enough, the blackbird, the bird known as the blackbird, is a European thrush about the same size and shape as our robin. It's a very close relative, in fact, it's all black. But most of our blackbirds have a little variety to them. Over on the left, we have the male brown cowbird. These are called nest parasites. Originally, they followed herds of bison throughout the Great Plains. And because they were following the herds, they got into the habit of laying their eggs in other birds' nests. So the young cowbirds are hatched, they're raised by the other birds, and eventually they join flocks of their parent species. And of course, here's a red-winged blackbird. This is a male doing his Okalee song at the edge of a march in probably April. If you know the Elvis Presley song, Oralee, it's based on a Texas folk song that's based on the call of a red-winged blackbird. And two more birds that are blackbirds are the common grackle, which again is a dark bird, but notice that they have that kind of purplish blue head and that bright yellow eye. They have a long V-shaped tail that helps them navigate when they fly. And then the Baltimore oriole. The male, of course, is a very orange-black bird. They're famous for building elaborate hanging nests that look like bags hanging into the trees. I find orioles most commonly in wooded areas abutting streams and ponds. Now here we have two birds that are in the same family, the indigo bunting and the northern cardinal. The indigo bunting, the male is a bluebird. Again, like all bluebirds, it depends on the light. So its feather color comes from the crystals in its feathers. The northern cardinal, of course, the male is this very bright red bird. They get their colors from eating berries containing carotenes. And if they're healthy, if they're eating native berries, I got to emphasize that, native berries, they're usually well nourished and they're in good health, bright red color. Now you might want to know, how can you attract birds? Well, one idea is to provide food. I do in fact feed birds year round. Here we have a male and female American goldfinch. The male, of course, is a bright yellow bird who has that black cap, black wings, black tail. Female's a little duller and she lacks the cap. Another kind of food you can provide, especially for hummingbirds in the early spring, sometimes for orioles and tanagers, is nectar. You don't need to buy expensive mixes. You can make your own. Basically, you take a cup of water and a quarter cup of just regular old syrup, dissolve the syrup, and you put it in a bird feeder. Now, this particular feeder was one of my favorites for a long time. I bought it at one of those dollar stores. It worked just as well. In fact, it worked better than a very beautiful, very elaborate blown glass feeder my sons gifted me with one year. Uh, Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find them the last couple of years in the dollar stores. So you don't need to buy an expensive one. I think a lot of products sold for ostensibly to attract birds do a better job of attracting buyers. Provide water. Here we have a male house finch. It's slightly larger than a sparrow, a little slimmer, kind of a various colors, anywhere from orange to kind of I would say kind of a purple almost, otherwise a brown streak bird. I bought this particular bird bath, but if you want a hint on making one, get yourself the largest plant saucer you can find. Get a tomato cage, stick the tomato cage in the ground, stick the saucer in and fill it up with water. Change the water every day or two, maybe once or twice a week. Scrub any mold or algae that's growing in the bird bath out. And you'll be surprised. June, July, August, even September, water attracts more birds than bird food. Of course, you may want to have birds in your backyard. You can go online, find all kinds of instructions for building birdhouses. This is actually a pair of bluebirds in a forest preserve. The Forest Preserve District of DuPage County is very actively trying to increase the bluebird population in the county. In fact, there are organizations dedicated to nothing but caring for bluebirds. If you go online, you'll find very explicit directions as to the size of the birdhouse, how far up it should be, the size of the hole. I would urge you to think simple is best. I've seen very elaborate, very ornate birdhouses being sold in garden centers, and I can't imagine any self-respecting bird moving into one of them, maybe a house sparrow or starling. A great idea for all kinds of purposes is to plant native plants. The more the merrier. I've had great success with purple coneflower, with bee balm or monarda, and I'm having some success with the drop seed, that is that little daisy-like flower. Birds come for the seeds. They also come for the insects. Let me talk about that for a little bit, because you may or may not be aware that we are currently experiencing what some scientists have called an insect apocalypse. The biomass of insects in some areas has been reduced 75 to 98%, depending on the time of year. The problem with that is insects are a major food source for our native birds. In fact, one tree species, the white oak, attracts over 500 species of moths that eat its leaves. That's a good thing, because the larvae, the caterpillars, attract birds. If you get a chance to plant a tree, if you need to plant a tree, research what native trees will do well in your area. And if your community is planting trees, urge the parties involved to plant as many native trees as possible. I have to confess that my village planted a Norway maple in my boulevard, I don't know how many years ago now. When we bought the house, there was a large Norway maple in the front yard that sooner or later, it's in the process of dying. But in the backyard, a young Norway maple volunteered, and before I knew better, it's reached a respectable size. I have, in the course of the 40 years I've lived in this house, raked probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Norway maple leaves. I have never noticed the Norway maple leaf showing any evidence that anything has chewed on it. And that is a bad thing. Well, we're talking about spring birding. So during the spring, one of the joys of bird watching and one of the real challenges are warblers. These are very small, usually colorful seed-eating birds. 36 species have been seen in our area. 6 are known to nest in our area. 2 that migrate through are the black and white warbler, seen here on a tree trunk, and probably the most common warbler, the yellow-rumped warbler. This one photograph doesn't show its yellow rump. It's great to see warblers in the spring because that's when they're in their breeding plumage. You wait till fall, and many of them change to duller plumages. The males look like the females, and there's a great deal of resemblance. And they are a challenge. Many birders work really hard to learn to recognize fall warblers. But if you look in the Peterson guides, he calls them confusing fall warblers. Well, here's another warbler that you'll see. It's common in grasslands next to marshes, called the yellow-throated warbler. You can see why. The male has this black mask and it's yellow. On top, it's kind of a brownish olive. Every once in a while, I've seen them fly, and I thought for a moment, oh, that's a sparrow. And then I put my binoculars on it, and it turns out to be a yellow-throat. Its call, incidentally, is very distinctive. It's witchety, 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 witchety. Now here's a warbler that doesn't look like a warbler at all. It's a little bit bigger than most. It's called a northern water thrush. I saw this at Lambert Lake in Glen Ellen. Oddly enough, a day or two before, I saw a related species called the Louisiana water thrush, which looks very similar, but it's almost white, where this one has that yellowish tinge to its feathers. And you'll see them at the edge of water. This one was circling Lambert Lake in Glen Ellen, hunting for insects. And as far as I can tell, it made 1 or 2 circles of the lake when I was there. Now, warbler identification can challenge even experienced bird watchers. So this is a prairie warbler that I saw in Florida. I've seen it here at Pratt's Wayne Woods too. But I called it one thing, and I was questioned, so I gave it a second look. I looked through the photographs I took at the time and found this one, and it's clearly a prairie warbler. But don't be discouraged. You know, someone once told me that an expert birder or bird watcher has misidentified more birds than the beginner. So, you know, I've come a long way, so I've misidentified a lot. Well, there's a lot of websites you can go to. I like eBird.org. It's run by the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. They have several other similar sites, including All About Birds, and they have many feeder projects. With eBird, you can explore it, or you can register, and that allows you to record what you see. The DuPage Birding Club has a website, dupagebirding.org. It's one of the largest clubs of its kind in the country. Currently, it has over 400 members. And if you go to their website, you'll find a lot of resources. You'll find lists of birds. You'll find links to very helpful material. Many of us in the club have written brochures describing birding hotspots. We've written brochures about attracting birds that go into things in more detail than I have. Okay, what happened here? Resume share. I'll do that. There we go. So this very good site to go to. And there's always Facebook, and you can find all kinds of places. The DuPage Birding Club has an excellent Facebook page where you can find out about meetings and field trips and other things bird related. I have my own Facebook page, John's Natural DuPage. I invite you to come and visit me. I cover a lot of topics, and you can kind of tell where I am by the pictures I post, and sometimes maybe even by how often I post. And so these are a lot of sites that you can visit to learn more. I mentioned most of them, but most of the counties in the collar counties of Cook County have their own Audubon groups that are excellent places to visit. I would urge you to visit the DuPage Forest Preserve's website, as well as the Will County Forest Preserve website. So that's all I have to say. If you like this, thank you, and get out there and bird.